This screencast is focused on Autumn 15 question 2, looking at advanced variances, in particular planning and operating variances. So you can have assumed you've read through the question fully and looked at the requirements. So if not, please go back, pause this screencast and look through it, and ideally try and attempt it as well before looking through this walkthrough. So here we have 4 main requirements. The first one is your basic variance requirement, where you're looking at calculate the direct material variances. Number 1 and 2 are your basic CAP1 variances, price. Typically we call it usage for a materials variance before planning and operating. And then the final 3, 4, 5 and 6 are your planning and operating variances for both price and usage. So again, you have CAP1 level variances and then you have CAP2 level variances. So that's for 9 marks. Part B then is a more narrative question around explaining what might be the cause of unfavorable direct material usage variances and how you might eliminate them. For 4 marks, so Part C asks you discuss and identify and discuss 2 possible unfavorable variances as a result of the purchase of new machinery. And finally then is nothing to do with variances, but they add on a small little risk question about 2 significant sources of risk for CAP. So again, it's always a good idea at the outset to read the requirements first. That'll give you some context in the question. So I've assumed you've read through the question. The broad background is that it manufactures minibars. It is exposed to commodity prices. In particular, one of its direct materials is this EF, which we have information here that it uses standard costing system. So the first requirement we're going to do is A1 and 2, looking at the materials variances. So we're asked the direct materials price, and we're going to call it usage. So here I typically tell students, if you're asked for the basic variances, I'm a big fan of the 3-column approach, where you look at AQ, AP, actual quantity, actual price, compare that to AQ, SP, and SQ, SP. So doing it this column makes you don't need to remember any complex formula, and again it's all done neatly for the examiner to understand where the figures are coming from. So in terms of actual quantity, actual price, we're told this in the question, it's 54,000 times 35. Actual quantity, actual price. Sometimes it may be a bit more complicated in questions where you have to work out the number of units and you may have to do a bit of work, but here you're told directly what the figures are. So 54,000 times 35 is 1.89 million. I'll just do these for formatting. Actual quantity again is 54,000. Standard price is 30. So it's 54,000 times 30, which is 1.62 million. And then finishing off your final column, you're comparing standard quantity, which is 50,000. You'd have only expected to use 50,000 kilograms and pay 30 euro. So you can see it's nice and neat. The examiner knows where you're coming from. And by comparing, I'll just put these in bold, by comparing both of these, you're holding the quantity standard, or you're holding quantity fixed, should I say, and you're changing the price. So that gives you the price variance. So you always just look at which one is changing. The price is changing there, your AP to SP, and the difference is 270,000. So I always leave the differences in absolute positive figures and label it then adverse or favourable. One big thing, if you go back and look at this question, is the examiner feedback for part A was students actually lost easy marks because they didn't label it. So they didn't label it adverse or favourable, therefore you lost very easy marks because the examiner didn't know whether you knew whether it was good or bad. In this case, standard price we would have expected costing 1.62 million. Using the actual price, 1.89. We expected to cost 30, it cost 35, so it must be adverse. So 270,000 adverse for your material price variance. The difference here for material usage is 120,000, that's the usage variance. And again, we expected to use 50, we actually use 54,000 kilograms, therefore that's going to be adverse as well. So the total materials variance is 390,000 adverse materials variance. Right, so that wasn't a relatively straightforward one, should I say, for the start of this question. But now we're asked for a bit trickier one. We're looking to split the price and usage variances into their planning and operational variances. Right, so it's important you understand the basics of planning and operating before we actually go on and try and attempt the question. So if we look at this here, What are planning and operating? Well, planning and operating arise when you have an updated set of standards. So we know what the actual standards are in the question. We have 54,000, or the actual what it was, 54,000 kilograms and 35 euro per kilogram. We also know what the original is. We expected the standard to be 50,000 kilograms times 30 euro per kilogram. However, if you have revised standards, maybe because someone made an error putting in the system, or something happened in the market that you need to update your standard, well then you need to go into split the total variance, which is original compared to actual, into what's called operating variances and planning variances. So we're told our revised standards in the question. So if we go back here, we're told, subsequently informed the standard price per kilogram should have been 32. So that's our revised price standard. And we're also told the standard quantity of direct material as a result of a new implementation of machinery should have been 8.75 kilograms per unit, and they're 5,000 units. So the question directly gives you what the revised standards are, and we now need to split our original two variances into four. You're going to have a price operating, a usage operating, a price planning, and a usage planning. And I like to tell students to set up a little cheat sheet like that in your notes. Here's some questions. So we're obviously doing this question now, that is where it's come up before. And I also tell the key points that you'll perhaps always make mistakes on when you go back and look at it yourself. And one of the key things I tell students are, if you're doing planning and operating, do a three-step approach. And by that, I talk about here, firstly, set out the three sources of information. What are the actuals? What are the revised standards? And what are the original? So something like this here. So your actual compared to revised will give you your operational variance, and your revised compared to your original will give your planning variance. So it's nice and structured, nothing more complicated, and you have all the figures in one little table that you can then go on to step 2, where you calculate your operating variances, and step 3 then for your planning variances. And note, it's the operating variances where you're comparing actual to revised. They are used to gauge managerial performance. So you only want to gauge managerial performance off an updated standard. It doesn't make sense to use the planning variances because they are really just due to a poor standard or an out-of-date standard. So it doesn't make sense to gauge performance based on those metrics. So that's important, that when you're looking at managerial performance, you look at operating variances. The planning variances are really just isolated because they're nothing to do with the managerial performance. So if we go back to the question, we'll try and come up with what was the actual, what are the revised standards, and what are the original. So it's a nice little table like this. So I might just put a little square around it. So something like this to show you know exactly what the information is. So you have quantity and you have price. So the actual we know is 54,000 and we know the price is 35. So a lot of the stuff we'll have done already. Likewise, we know the original is 50,000 and the price is 30. So what we don't know is what the revised standards are. So revised here, we're told the revised price should have been 32. So actually the original standard of 30 was too harsh. They know it should have been 32. It was actually an inputting error, and you're told that in the question. For the revised quantity, we're not given the total amount of kilograms directly, but we are told it should have been 8.75 times 5,000 units. So therefore, we should have been working off a quantity standard of 43, not 50. So that will have implications in terms of how we interpret the usage variance that we have. So that's your first step, is lay out the table like that. And now what we do is very straightforward. The first step is to calculate, or the second step should I say, this is your first step, 1. Second step is operating variances. And for your operating variances, the way I tell students to do it is, you remove the original or hide it. So for example, put a small bar over to ignore it. And now we're going to look at actual compared to revised. So all you're breaking it back down to CAP1 level variances now, because it's going to be actual quantity, actual price, compared to revised quantity, revised price. So you're just using two sources. And note, I use RQRP because sometimes you'll get confused by using SQSP because you have to use that in a second for the planning variances. So it's AQAP compared to, that should be AQRP. And finally, it should be RQRP. So again, it's very similar to the structure we took above, just using a different set of standards. So AQAP actually doesn't change. We've done that already. So it's going to be 1.89 million. So we'll have done some of this already. AQRP, in this case, is 54,000 times the revised standard, which is expected to be 32. So here it'll be 54,000 times 32. So I'll just change that so we have it nicely formatted. So it's 1.728 million. And finally then RQRP is 43750 times 32. They're the revised quantity times the revised price, which is 1.4 million. So you'd expect if you were on target based on the revised standards, it would have costed 1.4 million. So same as again, we're keeping quantity same, but we're changing price. So that will give our price variance. And we know that's our, should I put in as well, our operating price variance because we're calculating the operating variances. So the difference here is 162,000. And again, it will be adverse. So don't forget to label. The examiner was very disappointed last year. A lot of students lost out on easy marks because they didn't label them. So it's adverse because we paid 30, we expected to pay 32, we actually paid 35. So if you can't figure it out, go back to first principles. What did I expect? What did actually happen? So here it will be the operating, and I'll call it the usage variance. So in this case here, it is 1728 compared to 1.4. So it's 328,000, and again it will be adverse. Why? Because you expected to use 43.75, you actually use 54,000. So that is more than expected, so it's an adverse variance. So that's your second step, calculate your operating variances. Nothing more complicated than CAP1 approach, but you have to set it up firstly to help you along. Your final step, step 3, is your planning variances. So your planning variances, you're now comparing, as we've seen before, planning compares revised to original. So revised standard to original. So if we go back to the question, we'll unhide this. So if you're in the exam, you'd take away the biro, and now we'll actually hide the actual one. So we're not cared about actual, we've done that. We're now comparing RQRP, comparing RQSP and SQSP. So very similar structure, we're just using a different set of standards. The revised are in the middle, so they obviously overlap both. And we're now looking for what's RQRP. So again, don't forget you have some of this done already. RQRP is done from above. And likewise, SQSP is also done. Remember, we've done that initially of 1.5 million. So again, it will take a bit of time, but you'll realize a lot of the stuff will be overlap from work you've already done. The final one we haven't done is RQSP. So your RQ is 43750, and your standard or original price would have been 30. I should put in 30 there. So 43750 times 30. And just change the format. So in this case, we're comparing same quantity, but we're changing the price. So again, it's going to be planning, price variance. And the difference here is 87,500, which is adverse. And it's adverse because your original standard was 30, but now your revised standard has gone up by 2. Therefore, it's adverse. It's going to you expect it to cost more. So that's due to a planning movement. For the planning usage variance, the difference here, so I always leave it in absolute, so I leave it in positive figures. is 1875, and it's actually going to be a favorable variance. And why is that? Well, we expected to use 50,000 kilograms. We only used 43,750 of a revised standard. So the standard has fallen, so that's favorable from a planning movement. We're saving because we've revised our standard, because we've new state-of-the-art machinery. So overall, we've now split our CAP1 level variances, price and usage, from 2 variances. We've split that into 4. But one important insight, and again we're not asked here, but you may be asked to compare them or discuss them in other questions, is to compare and contrast what I call the CAP1 level variances, which is price and usage. So if we just slot them here, and this is important because it's important to get an insight of how they're related to each other. So CAP1 level is 270 adverse and 120 adverse. So both of them are adverse, and the total then is 390 adverse. They are CAP1 level. We split the material variance between price, so we obviously spent more than we expected, and usage. We used more than expected. But in CAP2 level, we now split it into 4. We have price planning, we have price operational, we have usage planning, and we have usage operational. And if we slot what they are in, the price planning was 162 adverse, price operational, sorry, I'm getting mixed up myself. The planning price was 87.5 adverse. The price operational, which is up here, was 162 adverse. The usage planning was 18750 favorable. So just put in the favorable, adverse, adverse. And the usage op here was 328 adverse. And the key insight to note here is if you add them up, so 187.5 plus 162 plus 328, and you take away the favorable one because that will obviously reduce it, you still get back to 390,000 adverse. So that's an important insight when you're looking at planning and operating variances, is the overall variance does not change. What changes is how you slice that variance, so slice and dice it to show what it is and how you interpret it. The total material variance does not change, it will always be 390, but how you interpret the variances and how you split them will change. And one small little error students do make is the price variance will not be the sum of these. Now it won't be too far away, but price will not be the sum of price planning, price op, nor will usage be the sum of usage plan, usage op. Okay? It's only the overall total that you can reconcile like that. So don't be too confused or worried that the sum of your price planning and price operation does not come back to your price. It won't. It only works on an overall basis. So if you're asked to interpret that, how might you interpret it? Well, if we look at here, for example, for usage, we said, well, overall, if we're using CAP1, poor performance because it's 120 adverse. All right? But actually, when you break that down between planning and operating, if you're looking at managerial performance, the CAP1 level actually understates how poor the performance was. Because we actually have a new standard that we would have expected an even better performance because of our new state-of-the-art machinery. So that's what the planning says. It says we expected an even better performance than our original standard. So we expected to only use 43,750 kilograms, not 50,000. But it turned out we ended up using, if I unhide this, 54,000. So by just looking at the CAP1 level, it masks the fact that the managerial performance was even worse than this, because it also aggregates together the positive planning movement and the completely negative operational variance for the year. So similar point here, that the 270 for price variance, actually some of that was due to a price movement, so it's not as bad when you're looking at managerial performance, because some of that movement, i.e. from 30 to 32, was just an input in the error, nothing to do with managerial performance. So again, it wasn't asked for here, but it can be asked in other exam questions. So it's useful to compare, contrast them side by side to understand why CAP2 level planning and operating variances can give a lot more information for performance measurement than just looking at basic CAP1. So if we look at the other parts of this question, there's B, C and D. And one important insight here is there's 12 marks for narrative. So over 50% of the marks of the question are actually for narrative as opposed to calculative elements. And one thing that a lot of students tend to do is, given that this was an optional question, they see variances straight away and they completely ignore or discount the question. Yet over half of it could have been easily obtained even before you started the variances. So if you weren't sure of your ability on variances, start with the narrative question first, get those completed, and then go on to the variances, because if you do run out of time, at least you have a lot of the chunk of the question done and you have marks on the board. And this is an also important insight here for B and C, that you need to be able to discuss and interpret variances as well. So part B asks you, based on your results from A, what advice would you offer COOL in attempting to reduce or eliminate any further unfavorable direct material usage variances that may occur? So again, all they're looking for is those 4 marks. You're probably looking for 4 solid points and moving on. The examiner does not want to see big long narratives with big long rambling paragraphs. So if I was looking at here, how would you offer advice to reduce unfavorable usage variances? Well, the obvious one is perhaps the standard is out of date. Given the fact that they've updated the revised standard here because they have new machinery, it may take a while to figure out what the actual standard should be. So perhaps consider revising it again in light of experience with the new machine. Right. Another one could be change your material supplier. Because if you're taking, you may be getting lower quality materials, that if you buy a higher quality good, then you may have less wastage and thus less of an unfavorable usage variance. So there's plenty of arguments, but the key point is to articulate why this would reduce it. A lot of students fell into the trap of just giving a very brief bullet point of listing this reason without actually explaining why would that reduce it. All right, so that's the key point here. The next point is also related to variances, and they argue in relation to COOL's purchase and implementation of new machinery, identify and discuss, that's important there, watch for the verb, 2 possible unfavorable variances that may occur initially. So you ignore part A, but if you took on a new machine, this is really an applied style question asking students to think about what variances might be impacted if I take on a new machine. Well, one obvious one will be direct labour. So direct labour efficiency, because if you take on a new machine, people may be getting used to looking at the machine, used to operating it, so they may be slower than expected until they become more familiar with it. And of course that's a concept in management accounting called the learning curve. Right? But the key point here is identify and discuss means you identify it and you also discuss why it may lead to an unfavorable variance. All right? So that's the first part. The second one then may be, for example, variable overhead efficiency, because of course direct labour efficiency and variable overhead efficiency are automatically linked because they're based on the number of hours worked. So if you're working more hours than expected, you'll have more variable overheads than expected. Another possible one students may look at is fixed overheads, because you may have extra maintenance costs, you may have extra fixed training costs that wouldn't have been in the standard initially, that would lead initially to an unfavorable variance due to the implementation of the machinery. So again, there's a various different ones you can look at, but you only need 2. But it's important that if it's 2 marks, you need to give a bit of discussion. And the examiner did identify in the examiner report, which you can get with this solution, that a number of students failed to specifically focus on 2 possible variances, but gave a rather generic list. All right? And those students or candidates who did not achieve full marks failed to provide a discussion of how the unfavorable variance would occur. So you need to actually identify but also discuss. So this is CAP2 level. You need to articulate why that is a reason. Finally then part D, which is more of a risk management. Identify 2 risks, and it's important here, particularly at the Sfma, students have poor exam techniques that they don't find and advise how they could be addressed. So it's not just identify, you need to advise. So it's probably 1 mark identify, 1 mark how to address it for 2 risks. So this should be relatively straightforward from the question. We've seen that there are big exposure to commodity price movements from the raw materials. So you're told that in the question. And you're also told in the question that they have significant debt because the interest cover ratio has declined significantly. So it's down to 2.2 times. And they also have floating rate debt. So you have three possible risks there about dealing with commodity price risk, dealing with financial risks in terms of their ability to pay interest going forward, and also interest rate risk because they have floating rate debt. And my advice would be, if preparing that question, and again you can go and look at the suggested solution, is take a tabular approach. On one side you identify what the risk is, for example risk, and the other side, in a nice little table, address it. So how would you do to address it? So for example, if it was interest rate risk, you might address it by entering into a swap agreement, entering into a forward rate agreement with a bank, or perhaps looking at interest rate options. The examiner is only looking for one, but you need to make sure you read the question carefully to get the marks, because even if you give 4 risks, the max you're going to get is 2 marks, because you haven't addressed the second part of the question. So we got that back to good exam technique as well as good knowledge of the syllabus. So this screencast focused on Autumn 15 question 2, looking at variances and a small bit about risk management.